This podcast is brought to you by Zen Educate, specialists in early years staffing. We save nurseries money on excellent early years practitioners through honest, transparent pricing. For 50% off your first day with Zen, call us on 020 3964 2566 or DM us on Twitter @ZenEducate. Over to June and Helen.
Hello and welcome to 10 with Zen with your host, Helen Woodward. Our guest today is June O'Sullivan, MBE, CEO of the London Early Years Foundation, a social enterprise with 39 nurseries across London, providing around 4,000 childcare places. So June, I'm so happy to be talking with you today. With a background in early years and from being a single parent, I fully get the huge impact high quality childcare makes, not only for children's learning and development, but also for the economic stability of families. And I'm struck by your quote, "I wanted to build a social model of great nurseries which could operate in poor neighbourhoods and be truly outstanding." So we love the mission, and the mission is great, and the challenges I know are many, and that's what we'd really like to talk with you about today. So June, we know there are really big issues at the moment with recruitment in early years settings. Can you tell us what factors are contributing to that?
Thank you for inviting me, Helen. It's always a good opportunity to talk about my favourite thing, pedagogy, children, social enterprise, and child poverty. All three, and indeed all four, are completely intertwined into the question you asked me. So there are many reasons for the pretty dramatic state of affairs in terms of recruitment. Now, you know, when you look at the TV, you think it was only really in the airports that we're having all of this recruitment crisis. But actually, the sector has been experiencing this probably since the COVID reopening of, post-COVID, but before that. So it tends to go back to 2016. So the first kind of problem we faced was when we had a particular minister, who indeed is standing as Prime Minister, who introduced the idea of you had to have a GCSE in Maths and English as an entry point to the sector. And she was quite keen that everybody had that from that point. And we did actually try to explain to her that there would have to be a pipeline and it would have to take a while to get to that stage. But she wasn't overly keen on that idea and wanted to introduce it. And so did so and changed the law. And then it took two other ministers to come and actually sort of in a way amend it, by which point we have the start of a really dry pipeline. And so effectively, if you needed a GCSE A to C in Maths and English, you could also go to university. The perception, rightly or wrongly, is that if you went to university, you had more chance in your career, you'd earn more money, and therefore you would be in a better economic situation. The truth is now, the evidence suggests that actually, through the apprentice route, you may earn more than a graduate, because with the gradualization of the whole workforce, everyone's got a degree. So therefore, it's now just a basic entry point. So that was the beginning, and that was 2016. Then we try, as I say, then took two ministers to address that. So really we're beginning to see the growth of opportunities in 2019 when then COVID struck. So then we went back to square one. The next thing that came along then was Brexit. And so a lot of the sector were relying on staff from Europe. In fact, we had already taken a number of Spanish staff. And the reason we had gone to Spain was because the qualifications of Spanish staff is most aligned to the UK. So it was a good place to go. And many nursery chains went there certainly in Ireland and also in England because of that connection. Plus our European Spanish teachers have a similar kind of attitude to the work, and it was easier to integrate from that perspective. That's then with Brexit and COVID, we saw that change almost overnight, where lots of our Spanish staff went back to their families, probably sensibly now when we realized how long it was going to take. And then the Brexit rules then kind of put some real barriers to entry around access, qualifications, income. Our Home Secretary then put a requirement of an entry point of 25 plus K to earn to come back into the country to work. And despite many missives to her, to try and make some flexibility around that, or to identify early years as a sort of special case, that hasn't occurred. Therefore, a lot of the staff would earn just under that. It may have changed a little bit now because of the crisis, but when we were trying to kind of open that gateway, that was another barrier. Then COVID came and changed people's attitude to work. So fewer people want to work 9 to 6, 5 days a week. Some people moved, and that already had been a bit of a pattern in London, but it was very much compounded with COVID, where people moved outside of Zone 6, really. And therefore the transport, although decent, actually is expensive. So that became an issue as well. So the first real indicators we had of a crisis was central London, because nobody wanted to come into Zone 1 because that's the highest cost of your train fares. And if you're getting buses, which many people do because it's cheaper, it takes a very long time to journey in. So those things were an issue. That said, during COVID, there was a glint of hope in the sector that actually parents really understood what we do and really began to realize the importance of not just the experience for their children, but in terms of the wider educational benefit and the economic support that offers. That seems to have sort of dwindled a bit. And with that, it kind of has almost confirmed a sense of depression, I think, amongst many people in the sector about the lack of understanding by the public of what we do, and therefore a lack of status. So you're talking here about sort of economic challenges, and then a kind of emotional and psychological impact of some of those challenges on the sector. And then finally, the sector is low paid. Now, we know that much of that, again, is about economic contribution. So the government contribution was locked in 2016 and hasn't really increased. I think the last increase we got was 17p. So that's really not going to make a difference to the cost of a place against the cost of a member of staff against what we earn, which I think makes organisations like ours all the more important, because, of course, the very children that need us the most, those in the disadvantaged background, have been most hammered by this, because they're in areas where they can't really carry that shortfall of cost to contribution. And so that's really significantly important. So there are some of the big issues. Kind of more recently, what we've noticed, and I had a really helpful call the other day with Ofsted to get them to do more, examination of this. But what they're seeing is what we're also seeing, is that there's a complete and utter lack of level 3s. And when you look at colleges, the pipeline into colleges is really low, if not at all. And while lots of colleges have kind of compromised and just run the health and social care qualification, the early years qualification is really depressingly low. So, for example, one of my managers was talking about it the other day, and she said in her area, which is East London, they would normally have expected to have, say, 30 graduates at the end of this course, and they had 13. And certainly I was talking to someone from a college in Southwest London who said they had just graduated 6 students, which is unreal for them. And so that's a problem, because what that means is that in the EYFS, you need to have a balance of qualified and unqualified staff. Now, no one's going to disagree with that, because we know from the research done by people like Iram Siraj and, various colleagues along the way, that actually structural quality, really depends on good quality ratios, child to staff ratios, and good quality staff. So therefore, no one disagrees with the idea of having qualified staff. And currently the ratio is 55% qualified to the rest unqualified, which I always think was always too low, and I always operated at 80-20. But right now, the people that are showing any interest in the sector at all, and the people that are likely to stay, are those who are unqualified. So my question yesterday was to Ofsted was, how do we start thinking a little bit more loosely about how we balance what qualified to unqualified ratio need to look like, so that we don't then have the consequence of exhausted staff who are covering the beginning and end of days, who are carrying all the kind of key person responsibilities, and who are having to operate in settings where either there are no agency staff, that there are very few bank staff, and some of the caliber of some of the agency staff is very low. So therefore the pressure on you is exhausting. And so now we're facing staff who are tired.
Sure. Okay.
And that's another factor in why they're leaving now. So, it's all built up into this picture of a pretty tired sector that feels unsupported, that is low paid, and feels low valued.
Okay. So you've given us a really, really comprehensive history there of what's been happening since 2016 in a sector which we know is absolutely essential for the economic stability of families and for the development of children and their education. So how is this now impacting on children and families?
Well, I mean, the simple maxim is, happy staff, happy children. So just a little bit of context. So during COVID, when we weren't allowed to have families in and we were trying to, manage through windows and gardens and, video and sort of non-touchy approaches, which is like very unusual and very unnatural in lots of ways, that saw an increase in complaints.
Yeah.
Because if you couldn't talk to a member of staff at the end of the day in the kind of natural way, or just stand, when you come and collect your child often, and I mean, I when I'm visiting, I often have this experience with parents. You sort of stand and chat, and you're watching the child sort of finish their day, and it's a kind of natural way of building trust and building a relationship. Nobody really, I think, appreciated the importance of that, and when it went away, I think everyone got very excited, and there's lots of tech zealots out there who think all answers to problems are dealt with by tech, but actually the human soft skills, interconnection, sort of trusting relationship is what missed, and therefore we saw more complaints, and Ofsted confirmed that. They weren't big complaints, but they were the kind of complaints that could be easily resolved because they were often needing an explanation rather than anything else. That we think is decreasing now that parents are back in the sector. So that's a good thing, because that was having a negative impact on staff who were like, I can't deal with any more complaints. We're doing our best. And then, they come in the evening, June, and all I get is emails, about this, that, and the other. And so that's now eased up. So that's a good thing in terms of staff well-being and staff kind of motivation and positivity. But the other thing is a lot of people now only want sort of to work shorter hours, flexible hours. And while you can do that for a cohort, you can't do that for the whole organization, because parents still need to work between 9 and 6, and children still need that stability of regular people in their lives. And the bond between a child and his teacher is, particularly in the early years, in terms of an early years teacher, is really strong. And for a lot of children, especially the areas we operate in, where 77% of our nurseries are in areas of disadvantage, the stability of the nursery is really important, because when you're living in an area of poverty and when you're dealing with poverty, it stresses parents. The instability of not knowing how you're going to feed your children and what's going to happen and how you're going to pay your rent, and all those kind of pressures on you where you have no movement, you have no margin to work within, causes stress. And the stress is represented in the relationship with the child and the parent. So for us to be there as a stable place where parents can be honest and say they're feeling stressed and not be judged, and the children love to come because it's a safe place and they're fed. That's the other thing. We have to make sure we feed them. Not all children in poor areas get fed. Lots of nurseries add quite a lot of money to the fees as a top-up because they can't afford the place. So they make the place unaffordable by charging quite a lot of money for food or additional services. We don't do any of that, because that means the child is kind of excluded or relying on a packed lunch. And for a lot of those children, that's not the healthiest option for them. So you have this kind of, emotional kind of pressure on nursery teachers who are trying to manage those kind of things that are bigger than them, plus managing their own circumstances, because they're also being hit by increased utility bills, increased cost of living, increased food costs. And the sector, and I think the majority of the sector want to do well by their staff, really finding it difficult to increase their salaries, because if you do that, you have to raise the fees, which then is counterproductive, because then the parents carry that sort of, additional burden. So that kind of stress, I don't think people realize how nursery sort of teachers and nursery managers feel that, and try to navigate that. And the LEYF staff have got the benefit of a central office team which is designed, and its entire purpose is to support them and to be available to them and to advocate for them and to try and help them to manage through that and give them guidance and advice and systems and all the other stuff. But imagine you're just a standalone nursery, or there's only one or two of you, and you're there on your own trying to work all of those tensions out. Is it any wonder that you give up. And is it any wonder that the statistics show very obviously to us that areas of deprivation are losing their nurseries much more quickly.
Okay. So, Juno, I mean, it's so interesting listening to you, and the breadth and the complexity of what you're working with is really clear. And it leads me to want to ask you a follow-up question that has kind of two aspects to it, really, because I'm interested to hear about the practical solutions that you're using, both in terms of managing the covering the staff shifts and covering the nursery day, because I understand that's a long day, because as you've said, parent hours don't change, so nursery hours need to be, I'm guessing you do what, 7:30 till 6?
8 till 6, sometimes 8 to 6:30, okay. Occasionally 7:30 to 6:30, depends. We kind of respond to parent need, but in fact they have shortened their days. So, but what we have are lots and lots of sort of groups of parents doing different shifts, and the intensity of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, where everybody wants to be in the nursery.
Yeah. Okay. So I've got a question about solutions. One is covering the lengths of the nursery day, and the other is, and you've started to talk about this, but I'm really interested to hear a bit more about how you're supporting staff kind of well-being and growth, professional growth during this time, because the stability that and again, I remember this so clearly as a parent, the stability of the nursery was absolutely key to being able to carry on earning a living, going to work each day and keep paying the bills. We couldn't manage without that nursery. A huge shout out actually to Educare in Manchester, because they were brilliant as well. So yeah, how are you managing those two things?
Okay, let's take them separately, even though, like I said to you earlier, everything is interconnected. So last Christmas, a colleague of mine, Lala Manners, and I wrote a book on Wellbeing. So the first thing we wanted to think about, and I was having a cup of tea with her, and I was saying to her, the thing about Wellbeing is often people see it as going to the gym or something after work or before work. But actually, when you think about the pedagogy that we certainly operate, Wellbeing is woven through this for the children. So what I wanted to do was really look at what they do in the day that's good for them as much as it's good for the children.
Sure.
So we wrote this book, which was really helpful, I think, for us to understand what amendments to the narrative of being an early years teacher could we make. So like when, the importance of understanding your sense of self and your own positive body image was a really important thing, because a lot of our staff, they lack confidence about who they are and what they do. And that status thing, stereotype thing, nice but dim, that kind of stuff does not help. You play with children all day. Yes, and play is a science, a small word that describes a deep, deep science about how children learn, but people don't get that. So we wanted to look at that. So we started with looking at sort of, starting right at the beginning, your sense of self, your sense of positivity, who you are. And then we went right through to, physical development. When you're doing play with the children outside, you also get out of breath because it's good for you. When we thought about nutrition, I don't know if you know, but I've been campaigning on good nutrition for a long time, and I set up the first early years chef academy because I felt that, with child poverty often is also aligned with child obesity. And so how do we address that? It's such a big complex issue, but one simple way to do it was to really look at what do our chefs do. And what I discovered was there was no proper training for our chefs. So I developed all of that. And then we set up our Chef Academy, which is now going very well, to train the chefs. And that was very interesting because in training them, we are training the staff about good nutrition for themselves and, portion control and all of that sort of stuff. Not in that kind of way of going on a diet or joining Slimming World, but actually about just minor changes to the way you think about things. We do yoga with the children. We have done for a long time. And what I wanted the staff to do was to them also enjoy it. So when you're doing this kind of stuff, that's also good for you as it's good for the children. When you lie in the garden and you just listen to the leaves or just hear the birds or just enjoy, that is good for you also. So it was really about defining what do you do in the day that's linked to we have a 7-strand pedagogy. That it also means is as good for you as it is good for the child. So what we did in that book was to extrapolate that out and pull those things through. And what we found, of course, is that staff do well when they feel engaged and warm and looked after and positive and valued. And so that really was how we wrapped that around. So that was the first thing we did. We also started to drill much more into our understanding of inclusion. I thought we were pretty good on inclusion for children, but does it filter through? What does it mean? My thinking was, if you're not inclusive, you don't build diversity. You just won't. But if you're inclusive, then by its very nature, you start to encourage, people from different parts of the world, different local kind of communities, all of that, getting much more involved. You also need some proactivity around it. But what I'm saying is that when you create that kind of culture, it tends to build itself, which is what we found in our organization. So in fact, Nasheen and I wrote a book on diversity and inclusion because we just wanted to celebrate some of the stuff that we do with children that's also good for adults. So like every time you think about doing these things, think about how it's also going to benefit you. So that was the way we approached it, a really quite practical way. On a more intellectual way, I worked with Mona Sacker from the University of Middlesex, and we wrote a book about social leadership and about identifying the complexities of actually leading a sector and the importance of it being taken seriously, because I wanted to give credibility to the sector that actually what you do is very important. It matters a great deal. And so that was just a way of us reflecting those thoughts in a book with engaging lots of people from the sector through a kind of piece of research. So we were looking therefore at leadership, at well-being, at championing the kind of joyful bits of our work, such as diversity and inclusion. Again, I've done lots and lots of campaigning on men in childcare, because I firmly believe you need to have women behind them to actually make it happen properly. And then we obviously looked at salaries. Because we're a social enterprise, we're not driven by dividend or profit from that way. So every penny we earn, I either split it amongst the staff or the children, and usually try and do both. This year, we put it all against the staff, feeling that really was where the need was. And so we were able to give a bonus and a pay rise. We gave your birthday off. We already have a very generous pension because the sector is mostly female, and women live longer and often are on their own, in their old age. So to be old and poor is pretty terrible. So I've always paid about 8% towards the pension, and always done that, and then encouraged them to pay more in. So, all of those things. So kind of like big picture behind the scenes stuff, as well as the obvious stuff, is what we thought about. And we have a council in the organization. So the staff council is very important because it gives you their voice, the importance of what people are saying, and the staff survey. The staff survey was pretty honest, actually.
Wow.
The three main things that came up were feeling tired and, their well-being. What could we do? More pay if you could. I mean, they all said, thank you so much for what you've given us. Can you give us any more? Well, they know we will. As soon as I can, I will. Can we make the progression in the organization even clearer? Because sometimes people don't know that you can enter LEYF at level 1 and you can leave as with your honours degree, and just making that journey clearer. And then there was a kind of message to us across the leadership to make absolutely sure that every touch point that new staff feel, and that includes apprentices, is really clear and warm, and that people understand that, how you treat people when they arrive. Even when you're busy and, you're just been waiting for these staff for ages and you're desperate to allocate them out a bunch of key children and, you just want them to get on. That is very important, particularly as some of our newest staff coming through have never been in a nursery. So they've been trained online, examples have been online, they've actually come away with no real practical experience. And while they've been maybe studying for 2 years, it's only in terms of length of months. It's not in terms of maturation and experience that drives that maturation process. So they haven't been in a nursery. They haven't worked with people. They haven't learned to deal with conflict. They haven't worked with having to stay extra. They haven't built those kind of emotional resilience and understanding of how to build empathy, to work with other people and see things from that point of view till they get into the nursery after their 2-year training. And then they're completely freaked out because the reality is, it takes a while. And when you're training, you're not in the nursery all the time. So you get a nice balance between being, whether you're online or in your university class or your college class or your wherever, and then going into work and, taking something from work and thinking about it and maybe doing a piece of action research and coming back and testing it. When you go in, like having spent 2 years on a screen, the reality is completely overwhelming. And so that's been the consequence, I think, for lots of staff. So well-being has to be multifaceted. And I think that's what we're continuing to do, and continuing to listen and continuing to think about other ways we can manage that.
June, you've given us an absolute whirlwind tour of everything around early years policy and how that has impacted on what's currently happening with recruitment, the impact for children and families, particularly in the economic climate that we're in, and some of the really wonderful, actually I'm inspired listening to you, solutions that you've been developing around staff wellbeing and progression. I started off with an NNEB and left school at 16. So progression for people that have left school without their A-levels and perhaps don't go to university till later. I wave the flag for that one quite frequently and regularly. It's a good one to hear. There is progression. You can have an early years qualification and you can progress. I'm going to ask you just for one more comment, really. I think if you had one message that you wanted to give to early years staff nationally, what would you share?
Well, I'm going to just be cheeky here and have one message and one call to action, if that's all right.
Go for it. So
the message is, believe in yourselves, consider yourselves teachers, stop messing around with educators and practitioners. Believe in what you do. You are actually a teacher of small children, the most important group of children in the whole education system. And so, step up and believe in yourself and own early years teaching as a very valid and wonderful profession, and use the language of teaching. And then my call to action is, let's come together with a blank sheet of paper and in a way answer the question you also asked, Helen, and think about what we can do differently within the context of the EYFS about how we allocate places, how we think about using qualifications, how we think about allocating qualified staff, how we can kind of be flexible in what we do. And I have already spoken to Ofsted and they're very open to this kind of conversation. So I'm going to launch a round table on the 19th of September.
Okay.
With Ofsted and the DFE and people who are running nurseries, and look at this with a completely fresh set of eyes and think, now what can we do within the context that doesn't devalue our responsibilities and the importance of what we do with the children, that doesn't make us feel unsafe because we're changing things radically, but that actually gives us some control over how we interpret the way we allocate and delegate our staff so that we can manage the day more effectively. So that will be an invitation via my blog to everyone on the 19th of September to actually come with this creative possibility. You can, but I would advise that you read the EYFS very carefully first and see where is the room for some interpretation and flexibility.
June, that's been brilliant. Thank you so much. And we've heard those two things: believe in yourself and the call to action around how do we look at the current policy and guidance and look at what flexibility and creativity there is, which enables everyone to get the best possible outcomes for children and young people. Lovely. Okay. Thank you so much, June, for being our guest today.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us on 10 with Zen.
This podcast is brought to you by Zen Educate, specialists in early years staffing. We save nurseries money on excellent early years practitioners through honest, transparent pricing. For 50% off your first day with Zen, call us on 020 3964 2566 or DM us on Twitter @ZenEducate. Thanks for listening.